And finally, this week saw a celebration at a really venerable institution, Hansard, the official report of parliamentary debates. A new website has been launched encompassing the entire Hansard archive, stretching back to 1803. I went along to the launch of the website and talked to a few people about what Hansard does and what it's like working for an organisation adept at turning the sometimes rambling prose of our politicians into crystal clear language on the written page. I spoke to two Hansard editors, Jack Homer and John Weiss. I asked Jack Homer first, what exactly were they launching?
A new website which is much, much bigger than the old one. So in very simple terms, we have 200 years of content now available in the same interface that people can use to see what happened in Parliament yesterday. That content is now much, much more easily searchable than it was in the past. What we did a few years ago when we had some seed corn funding for this was take the volumes that started to make sense, scan them in, and what you're seeing today is the scanned text.
And some of the work you can search online could have been written by the hand of Charles Dickens, is that right?
Indeed, not only Charles Dickens, but also William Hazlitt, William Cobbett and a few other luminaries from that time were in fact shorthand reporters in the House of Commons. And although many, many things have changed, some things haven't. They worked in shifts, so they could produce things quickly. They went in and out and wrote very, very long documents. That's an interesting part of the site, is that there's a continuity in Hansard for all of that time.
Charles Dickens didn't ever work for Hansard. He worked for one of its competitors, which is called the Mirror of Parliament. And a couple of prime ministers said it was a more accurate report than Hansard at the time. So Dickens worked for the best parliamentary report and not Hansard, unfortunately.
Now, a lot of people think that Hansard is a word-for-word account of what's said in Parliament. That's not right, is it? What do you do exactly?
The heart of it is the difference between the written word and the spoken word, and every day when you or I speak, we make all kinds of errors that the ear doesn't really pick up, and it's that really that the Hansard reporters are doing. They're trying to show the world very, very clearly what was said.
How has it changed over the years?
I think it's arguable that proceedings have become a bit more informal. There's less of a consciousness of being an orator than perhaps once there was.
And there was someone else at the launch I vaguely recognised. My dad, John Parker, who used to scribble away in high-velocity shorthand in the Hansard team when I was a lad. I asked him who was his favourite politician for taking down in shorthand.
Well, certainly Enoch Powell, if you're a Hansard reporter, was the dream take. You know, we did it in 10-minute takes, so you go in, you've got 10 minutes of Enoch Powell. It all hung together, quite complicated sentences. All you had to do was take it down, and he spoke at a reasonable pace, take it down and put in the commas and the full stops, etc.
It's often said that people speak more quickly now than they used to in the old days. Would it have stretched even your shorthand skills today, do you think?
Well, it stretched my shorthand skills back then. People were very fast, especially Prime Minister's Question Time. When I started, it was Wilson and Heath, Wilson as PM, and I would come out dripping in sweat because it was so fast. And we only had shorthand, there was no tape backup then.
Meanwhile, Pippa Kelly worked in the Hansard box, the best view in the House of Commons through the Thatcher, Major and Blair years. What was it like being a Hansard reporter? And were people happy with what they did?
Most people were. Some people, I don't think, quite appreciated what we were doing for them. So, for example, he's an absolutely great man, John Prescott, but I mean, maybe he'll correct me, but I'm not sure he quite appreciated what we did until the inestimable Matthew Paris devoted an entire column to verbatim Prescott and then what Hansard said Prescott said. And after that, I think the relationship changed a bit between us. I was thinking about what it was that made John Prescott so difficult to report. There's a huge difference between the written word and the spoken word, and often the best orators are the trickiest to write, to translate into the written language.
Because you could understand exactly what John Prescott was saying. Because
Absolutely.
He said,
And what he did, and there was a lot of passion behind it, which was why he was a good speaker and would rouse an audience. But because of the passion, maybe you get a bit carried away. So he used a lot of words, and nearly always it was reduced.
And as a Hansard reporter, you're sitting in the press gallery directly above the Speaker's chair.
Yes.
You've got a bird's eye view
Absolutely. We have the
on
best seats in the House.
History in the making. Now,
Yes.
Tell us about some of the best, most memorable parliamentary occasions you witnessed.
Well, as it happens, I personally reported Geoffrey Howe's famous cricketing speech when he basically did for Thatcher in November 1990. And I was a trained journalist before I became a Hansard reporter. And there were a few occasions, really. There were one or two when I just so thought, gosh, I wish I was still in journalism. And that was definitely one of them because it was electric. And I also knew that I was not going to change one dot, not one semicolon, because it would be poured over. And also it didn't need to. It was the most perfectly crafted speech. And then I was in the chamber when Thatcher gave the speech, the day when she'd left, but she came back and she said, to Dennis Skinner, I'm enjoying this.
Yeah.
Yes. There was another, I was really very new, green round the gills, just qualified reporter. And I was sitting up in the press gallery in what we called our box. We had the two best seats above the Speaker's chair. And there was even then, very elderly Tory member who sat below the gangway. And it took him quite a while to rise to his feet anyway because he was so old. And so often he didn't get the Speaker's eye, but he did. And I was sitting there sort of trembling, thinking he is going to catch the Speaker's eye and then this is going to be a nightmare. So he spoke for about 6 minutes and I couldn't hear one word. Well, I heard 2 words of what he said and they were Cold War. So I went back absolutely shaking and whey-faced into the reporter's room and said to somebody more senior than me, look, I've had this terrible experience. I don't know what he was saying. I couldn't hear it. His articulation was so sort of poor. And they said, well, you'll just have to sort of think about what he might have said. What side of the argument was he on? So I thought, OK, well, I think I know which side of the Berlin Wall he was on. And then send it down to him for him to check it, which I duly did, having basically sort of made this thing up. And I sent it down to him and it came back very promptly and he'd made 2 amendments and he capitalised the 2 words Cold War. Because Hansard was notorious for not capitalising many words. And so those were his 2 amendments.
So you're there in the chamber trying to make sense of what people are saying. Are there sometimes misunderstandings?
Yes, it's sometimes very difficult to hear, especially when there's what we used to call rather sort of formally a sedentary intervention, which is basically when somebody shouts out from a sitting down position and interrupts somebody who's on their feet speaking. And somebody who was very good at doing that himself was the late Tony Banks, a Labour member. But on this occasion, he was actually making the speech. So he was on his feet and then he was interrupted or intervened upon by a Liberal Democrat member. And it wasn't me, but the Hansard reporter, thought they'd heard it, but thought, was that absolutely right? And, you do always check. So sent down to Tony Banks and said, have you just been accused by that Liberal Democrat member of being a Marxist-Leninist stooge? And Tony Banks replied with the little slip and said, oh, no, it was much worse than that. He accused me of wearing a Marks and Spencer's suit.
Pippa Kelly on high drama in the House of Commons.